and I am going to start tonight. I welcome you. I'm Delisa Randall Griffiths, and I am one of the co-chairs of Ashland Chautauqua, and this is our 5th book talk. We've been through the whole lineup, and now we're finishing up with our book on Annie Oakley. But before we begin, I'm going to share my screen and show just a few slides. So let me get that shared. And I thought while I'm sharing my screen, I might as well give you the lineup for those of you who are able to make it to Ashland, Ohio. So we're halfway between Cleveland and Columbus in North Central Ohio this summer. July 12th through the 16th, this is our lineup of people that will be presenting their characters and doing workshops during the day. So I thought, well, I might as well, if I've got slides shown, I might as well show you this. And you can see at the bottom, our programming could not happen without a committee that works year round, a volunteer committee, but then also lots of sponsoring organizations. And you can see from that lineup there, some of them are local, Explore Ashland and the city of Ashland, and a couple of local businesses that work with us. Ashland Main Street's our fiscal agent, but then on either end they're kind of bookending Ohio Humanities and Ohio Arts Council. So we get support from the state, and we're really grateful for all of the support we get to make this happen each year. But one of our committee members, Dorothy Stratton, took some pictures that we wanted to show you. So Annie Oakley is buried in Ohio. And so this is, Darke County is right there at the state line where Ohio and Indiana meet. And this is just a little north of US Interstate 70 as it goes across the state. And this is the marker at Annie Oakley's grave. And it's a wonderful picture. I'll wait just long enough so that you can read what it says. But then we also have pictures of the grave markers that are right here around this sign. So let me go ahead and go to this. So here's Annie Oakley and Frank Butler, who died, I think 3 weeks apart from one another or something like that. And you could, if you're driving on 70, headed to Indiana, if you ever want to stop by, you could just go a little bit north and see this. And I love this shot. So many people must visit this grave and leave their coins and the bullets as some sort of honor to Annie Oakley's life. So those we thought would be a great way to start the evening and get you in the mood to hear about Annie Oakley. So Elsa Wolff is here with us, and she's talking about Larry McMurtry's book, The Colonel and Little Miss, Buffalo Bill, Annie Oakley, and the Beginnings of Superstardom in America. But she's also going to give you just a little bit of background to get started. And if you haven't read the book, that's fine. What we'll ask you to do is, after Elsa talks for a little while, we would like to open things up for questions. So if everyone could go ahead and mute their mic so we don't have any difficulty with extraneous sounds, but the chat could be used to ask questions, and then I will help moderate those questions. And we love it when we get lots of people, asking questions. And sometimes the questions kind of piggyback off of one another. So feel free as things go along this evening to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to as many of them as we can. So Elsa Wolff has been to Ashland 3 times before, I believe. And we're really excited to have her back again this summer. She hails from Colorado, as you heard, and she will be portraying Annie Oakley for us. But I will just mute my microphone and turn things over to Elsa.
Thank you, Lisa. What an interesting and fun format to do some preliminary talk about all the characters and to start diving into that story. Really, it's the story of people's lives that got me interested in Chautauqua, because I don't consider myself at all a historian, but very much a humanitarian. And so I love that thing of getting into somebody else's perspective, into their shoes. And Annie Oakley is just such a fascinating person to me, the thing I enjoyed and sometimes got frustrated with, I suppose, was the book that we're going to be talking about talks a lot about Buffalo Bill. So it was a good occasion for me to learn more specifically about Buffalo Bill. When you study Annie Oakley, so much of what her story is intertwines with the Wild West. And so I know facts about the Wild West, but then to find out that background about the main personage, Buffalo Bill, the Colonel, that was really interesting. And I also want to set this stage that he is not my character. So the primary questions, that you might have about him, I probably have as well, because he's not the one that I am trying to portray, but understanding him a little more deeply, he and the Wild West are the context of 16 years of Annie Oakley's primary, the prime of her life, was set in the context of Buffalo Bill, of the Colonel, of the Wild West. So it's really great to be able to have learned a little bit more about that, because those questions come up, and I would usually say, in the Q&A, oh, that's interesting. I don't really know that. Now I know a little bit more. So that's been fun. The thing I find fascinating, and I think this is what drove Larry McCurtry to write about this, is this idea of stardom in America. When you think about America, there's the history that's going on, the political history, and then there's this whole sub history, I think, and that is entertainment in America, and the different forms that it's taken. And entertainment in America changed so much once film came into the picture, and we find Annie Oakley and Buffalo Bill poised, that is, right at before film came in. Actually, it was, even though everyone was so excited about it, is actually what killed, I think, the Wild West show, was this onset of film. And we hear in this book how Buffalo Bill tried to dabble in filmmaking without much success, because what he managed to do at this critical time frame, and this is what I believe that the author so well described, is that Buffalo Bill's timing was perfect. Between the closing of the frontier and the fascination with all that meant, the frontier was, what would it be like saying space travel, right? It's that thing that's like, oh, it's captivating our imagination. We don't really know what it would be like to be up in a spaceship, but we get images now and then, we hear stories. And so maybe that's where we are poised, right, in the pre-space travel, which is probably going to become a very regular thing. But back then, in these 1880s and up through 1920s, that was the story that was being told, and that was the fascination. So Buffalo Bill, in his forming of this Wild West show, was telling a story that everyone wanted to hear. And what I have always found fascinating about Annie Oakley is that her platform wasn't just in America. The fact that the Wild West show then and the frontier, that story became, the interest in that was stronger, if anything, in Europe. And that they get to take then this story of the frontier and some of these really uniquely American things and bring them overseas. I think of The Greatest Showman, of course, the circus was a big deal. And of course, performance, so circuses were a thing. And circuses were the performances, and I remember that line in The Greatest Showman, the oddities from America, which was what the circus provided, oddities. But what Buffalo Bill provided was what was being billed as, Buffalo billed as, a picture of history. Now, it was history from a particular viewpoint. And certainly us with our vast knowledge of all that we know now. We would call it perhaps a manipulated history. But it was the story that was being told, and it was the fascination. And so I don't have formally prepared remarks, so I'm just kind of talking about just how it hits me. But I lived in Germany in the 1980s, so 100 years after Buffalo Bill was there. But I can say that within German culture, the Native American there is such fascination and such deep respect and reverence for the Native American, for the Indian. I mean, there's a guy who lives in Germany that lives in a teepee, and he tries to do everything he can as true. And, it's just such a mind-bending thing, like he's German, but he got in big trouble because he had like Native American artifacts. And then they got all upset that he shouldn't have those. And whatever, that's a different discussion. But here's this man who was so captivated by this story of the Native American that he decided he was just going to, almost like what is it called when you go Mecca, the kind of, just going back to some kind of spiritual route to pursue this life of the Native American. So anyway, I think it's an amazing thing that when you talk about not only stardom, Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley in a pre-movie, pre-silver screen era were known throughout America, definitely, and overseas. There was not any other American figure, as I think he brings up in this book. I've read probably too many books on Annie Oakley, but I believe Larry was the one. Larry, can I call you Larry? I think he's fine with that. That there wasn't any other American figure, not even president, not even political leaders, that matched the fame and the stardom that Annie Oakley and Buffalo Bill achieved in an era before mass communication. So he tells that story. I think that was kind of the point of his story. And then, so I find that really fascinating, and that was good to read. I also found the book somewhat difficult to read because it was not chronological. It was shotgun approach, pun on words, but very, you would talk about one thing and then all of a sudden we're going back and you're like, wait, I thought we were talking about Buffalo Bill's dead or Nate Salisbury's dead. No, Nate now. So it was very kind of chopped up. Although I don't think he ever intended, and he said right at the beginning, this is not intended to be a chronological discussion, but that did sometimes make me crazy in reading it. And yet he did, I think, address just all the different elements that went into how they became such superstars, not only in America, which would makes sense, but overseas as well. And then the other thing, I think, just he compared and contrasted who these people were. Buffalo Bill kind of being the real thing, right? He wasn't just play acting. He was the Prairie Scout. He was the Killer of Buffalo. He was the Pony Express rider, albeit a short time, but whatever. That was part of his story. He was the frontiersman. And so he had this vision. I think he was a visionary, and he shared that vision. Now, Annie Oakley, her whole life fought to be known as the real thing, but not Western. That's the whole thing, is she wasn't a Western girl. She wasn't a frontiers girl. She was from Ohio, which, by the way, is a beautiful state, and I love Ohio. And yet she was kind of billed as the Western girl. She was the frontier lass, which she wasn't, but she was the real thing. And that's what she lived to show, that because at that time, there were fakers everywhere. There were the charlatans, you know, the people who faked the trick shooting, and she was the real thing. So the Buffalo Bill, his life was either pursuing the real things like going on a buffalo hunt or managing Indian affairs in a very real way, the ghost dance, you know, ghost dancers in 1885 or whatever that was. Annie Oakley was about more than just the show. She was about shooting. And she was about things that she did get compassionate about and that are passionate about, and that was teaching women how to shoot and actually showing up on the radar in other ways than just the Wild West show. However, the Wild West show was her ticket to London, for instance, where she started teaching women how to shoot. It was her ticket to be in the circle of competitions where she's competing against the Grand Duke of Russia, you know. I mean, so it opened up the doors of opportunity for her as a woman, and as a she wasn't the only woman shooting, but I guess in all of my research, I would say she was the most real thing that was out there in what she did, and that she had ambitions not just to be part of a show, but to really show up in other ways that were very sincere and real and real time, not just production, but practical ways of showing up. So that's just a really brief kind of overview of what I kind of picked up from the book. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what other people's experience was, if you got to read the book, or even if you just start looking at the life of Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley, and or just look at the history of the Wild West.
So I'm going to start with a part of Dorothy Stratton's fourth question that we sent you. And please, people, put your questions in the chat if you have questions where you want her to talk more about Annie Oakley's past, because some people wouldn't have read the book and some people may not be real familiar with her past. So stick those in the chat. But Dorothy asked, why do you think he titled this book, included her in the title of the book, and yet most of the book isn't about her? Or I won't read the whole question, but it's almost as if he was a little dismissive, or maybe didn't even really like her in the accounts in the book. So why do you think Larry McMurtry put her on the headline, and yet the way he wrote about her seemed very different?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it would be a good question to ask him, obviously. If I were to intuit the answer to that, my guess is maybe he set out, honestly, to just write about Buffalo Bill and the Wild West. But I would imagine the more you do that, you keep running into Annie Oakley, because they both were on this trajectory that I think was perhaps unexpected. Like, Buffalo Bill wanted his show to be a success for financial reasons, I believe. And then it ended up taking on this whole other life. And so he and then Annie Oakley just became so entwined with him that maybe he just thought, oh, well, she keeps showing up, I'm just going to put her in there too. I don't know if he didn't like her. She wasn't as fascinating to him, for sure. Because there were sometimes, you used the word dismissive. He did seem like, well, yeah, you never really get to know about that. But someone like Cheryl Casper, I'm just going to hold up this book. Cheryl Casper wrote about Annie Oakley, and he refers to her. And this was the best book I read about Annie Oakley, was the Cheryl Casper's Annie Oakley. And he refers to that. She's a fascinating person. And he kind of, I think, because he was looking at Buffalo Bill being the picture of the frontier picture, she was more on the ride with the Wild West show, but she wasn't a part of the frontier that was fading. She was a part of the show. So in that way, there wasn't as much as he could say, except she also made a very good contrast to him. I love the way he actually started out when he's comparing how they die, I mean, their funerals, because it really did kind of sum it up. You know, Buffalo Bill's funeral just became this out of control thing, and it is in Denver, which is super cool. I live, and who is it? The Ellen, I believe you're from Denver too. In Morrison, I live right at the foot of Lookout Mountain, which is where Buffalo Bill's grave and the museum is. But, you know, and then he's got these connections with Wyoming. And of course, there's this big, I think they do it to just drum up interest, but there's this big thing that he's not really buried in Denver, that he's actually buried in Wyoming, whatever. The whole thing got a little out of his control. And Annie Oakley, it was very in control and exactly what she wanted, and very reserved and very dignified. So I think perhaps what Larry, as he did his research, you see this interesting contrast, and two people who are so different, but that rode the same horse, so to speak, into fame and notoriety with such different approaches to it. And even the responses to, for instance, Buffalo Bill had, the money came and went and he was very irresponsible with it. Annie Oakley, of course, part of this is her history of being very poor and being abused even, and without power, powerless and poor. She experienced powerless and poor. And I think it set the tone for the rest of her life then, and she was never going to let that happen again. And so she kept a very tight rein. And Frank Butler, her faithful husband, they were on the same page with that. They were together. They saved. They were frugal. She talked about taking terrible losses one time she kind of participated in a poker game. She lost 83 cents and she'd never let that happen again. So, you know, to her, that was just unacceptable. So to answer the question, why he titled it Little Colonel, the Colonel and Little Missie, but really gave her very little due. I think he gave her credit for where she showed up and addressed her fame, not necessarily her whole story. It's maybe to him certainly not as fascinating a story as Buffalo Bill, but her fame was a result of her remarkable marksmanship, which to this day, as Will Rogers said, it's still a mark to hit, and I'm not sure anyone has. But not only because of her shooting, but because of her association with the Wild West. That might not have answered it completely, but y'all can chip in and ask, for me to clarify.
Well, and someone put in the chat that you do have to remember that book titles are often created by editors rather than writers. So I guess we don't know who thought that would sell more copies. That's quite possible. Yeah,
that's true, because you throw in Little Missie, and that's like who, and it's a good part of his story. Their association is a good part of the story.
Now, people feel free to put those questions in the chat, but I'm going to go back and maybe you have already addressed this, but maybe there's more to say. So what do you attribute to Annie Oakley not getting caught up in the celebrity status and the high living? I mean, is there more than just the frugality, because she could have gone a different direction?
Oh, she could have. And there's so much to say about that to me. Who I've come to, of course, all my characters, I come to love them, and I feel protective of them as well. And this is maybe a little bit of a bunny trail, but I think this is where it can come in. This is why, what your question is, why I can hardly, it's great music, but I can hardly watch Annie Get Your Gun. From a historian's perspective, my husband would just say, calm down. I was writhing with the inaccuracies of the personhood of Annie Oakley. The songs truly are great. I mean, who doesn't want to sing, anything you can do, I can do better. which is somewhat true, that she literally said, a woman can do anything a man can do, aside from heavy manual labor, which, by the way, is an almost exact quote of Amelia Earhart. Just throwing that in. However, the mannerisms and the way that Annie Oakley gets portrayed in Annie Get Your Gun, there's two sides of a coin. I mean, the fact that her legend lives on is super fun, but the inaccuracies are tragic in a way, because they are the antithesis of how she did live her life. And this is what you're bringing up a little bit, Delisa, and that is, she wasn't caught up into the show business. And as you read her own words, and as you read a historian like Cheryl Casper, there are two factors, I would say, that answered the question you're asking. Number one, look at her heritage. Quaker family. And I cannot, as a historian of Annie Oakley, dismiss her Quaker heritage and her faith. I mean, and any historian says she had a book with her all the time, and it was the Bible. So her faith was not just I grew up, my mother and my father were like that, but I went away from that. I believe that was very much a part of her makeup and that identity. Now, as a Quaker and as a woman of faith, and keep in mind, historically speaking, a Victorian woman, this is in the Victorian age, she was not bucking against that. She was a Victorian woman, and she wanted to be known as a lady. So right away, she was in conflict with the fact that she was in show business. So her family initially would have said, you might as well you're going to hell, because you can't be in show business and be a person of honor. I mean, that was the opinion. So she set out to prove that she could be a lady, a Victorian lady, a person of honor, and be involved in show business. So that is one of those things I think that is a hallmark of her life throughout, to show. And it was so important for her to be known as the real thing, that is not a fake. And that when she would arrive at London, her favorite quote that someone said, and I love bringing this up, is she shot at a gun, at the Wimbledon, is that where they do tennis now? That was a gun club. So that's cool. But anyway, she was invited to shoot there, which was remarkable as a woman to be invited into a man's world in that regard. She was respected for her shooting. And so she was, competing. They have the little blue rocks, these little pigeons that they do there. And she missed more than she usually did. So this reporter came and said, I expected to find a better shot, but I did not expect to meet such a great lady, which was, to her way of thinking, the highest compliment. She wanted, of course, and the competitive nature in her would make sure she did get better, and she did. There was a man who actually made her a gun that helped her become better at shooting when she was in London. But the fact that she would be known as a lady was really, really important to her. So the fact that, and this comes out again when this whole, the terrible, terrible article came out in 1903 that she had been arrested for stealing trousers off of a Negro to buy cocaine. That whole William Randolph Hearst debacle, fake news, and so that was the arrow in her heart, because here he's slandering her name and her reputation, which she had worked so hard to build up. So I just think that the show business, that it was part of what she just knew she could do well, but she was not enticed into, whatever we would, and the same concerns we're having that her family would have had. Well, you're going to get sucked into immoral living, and it never happened. She was with her husband. He was protective and loving. And that's the other thing that makes me crazy about, I know I'm talking way too much, but that's the other thing that makes me crazy about Annie Get Your Gun, is it's all set up as if Frank Butler and Annie Oakley were in competition with each other, and they never were. Once he realized how much people loved her shooting and hitting what she aimed at, he stepped back and did everything he could to promote her. So to the point that he left her name on if you look at all the posters, Miss Annie Oakley, it's always Miss Annie Oakley, because that sells. If it's Mrs. Frank Butler, no one cares, right? So even after, she's known by people who know her as Mrs. Frank Butler, but to the world, she's Miss Annie Oakley, because that sells, because it's more alluring, and she's young, and she's got the brown hair, and she does this little kick. So she's kind of portraying a single, I don't know, it's such a weird thing, but everything in the rest of her life is on the up and up and of utmost dignity. So much so that when Randolph Hearst sent people to dig up some dirt on her, nothing was there. He could find nothing. Thinking, of course, this woman's been in show business this long, surely there's some indiscretion. Couldn't find it. Wasn't there? I don't know if that answers the question, but those are my thoughts.
I'm going to go a little out of order here because I think this fits, because Ruth asked, why did she have so many lawsuits against the newspapers? So that's dovetailing into what you're talking about, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is, it's such a great story because it's just so we can get it from fake news. It wasn't called fake news then, it was called yellow journalism. And William Randolph Hearst, he did what would sell papers. So when this article came out, and you'd have to, I can't really break down all the details, but it was this situation where this young woman was arrested, and that situation was true. She had stolen some trousers and was trying to sell them because she had a cocaine habit, whatever. And then she says something like, yeah, I'm Cody, Buffalo Bill's niece, or I don't know. She says some abstract thing and say, oh, you're Annie Oakley. And she says, yes. The girl is 29 years old. Annie Oakley's 40 years old by then. This is in Chicago. Annie Oakley hasn't even been in Chicago for more than a year. There's just all sorts of things where any amount of journalism would have been, oh, that's not Annie Oakley. I know, literally it takes 2 minutes of asking questions to go, that's not Annie Oakley. But the story sold papers. So the first paper comes out, then all the other goes, oh, this is a big seller. We're going to sell papers. Hear ye, Annie Oakley in jail for, her habit with cocaine. It's going to sell papers. It's yellow journalism. So she unbelievably has people start sending her these articles. And I love portraying this part of her story when I'm Annie Oakley. I just get so mad and so indignant. In the South, they shoot a man for slandering the good name of a woman. I couldn't shoot him, but I could aim where it hurt. And I mean, she's just, you get her indignation at this because she has worked so hard. My dog's worried about me. It's okay, honey, because I was yelling. Anyway, so she is all about protecting her good name. And so every paper that ran that article, it was just ridiculous. She sued them all. It was the biggest libel suit in American history to that point. And she won 54 out of the 55. Everyone always wants to know, what about the 55th one? Like, I don't know, but every single paper ran they refuted it. What's that called when they say, never mind, we were wrong. And all of them apologized to her. All of them apologized. So some of them had to pay the money, and that's William Randolph. He had to pay the money, and so that's why all those lawsuits. It took her 7 years of her life, 7 years of fighting that, but it was what she was about, protecting that reputation. I don't know if that answers that question, but.
Here's a question from Susan Marie. How did her name change from Phoebe Ann And I see Moses, but I see Mosey
Mosey.
to Annie Oakley.
You know, that's one of those, I like to say, there's a couple different theories on that. She never is exactly clear. There is an area near Cincinnati, apparently a park, Oakley Park, or an area near Cincinnati named Oakley. She just knew when she started performing with her husband, Frank, that a stage name needed to happen. And her family, she went from Phoebe and the whole Mosey Moses, that's a whole nother mess. I'm really glad, by the way, Delisa, that you showed that tombstone because it said Mosey. I see Moses more than Mosey, but I think I'm going to go with Mosey since it is on her tombstone. There was even a family disagreement. Her brother and she were in disagreement about what their family name was. I don't know how that happens, but there you go. So how she changed her name was her family called her Annie right from the start. Phoebe, they said, was much too formal a name for the kind of girl that she was. She, you know, tomboy would certainly describe who she was. She loved shooting right from the start and would just skip out of school and, you know, go barefoot in the woods. But so they called her Annie from the start. And then at the point that she started performing, she chose a stage name, and that's where Annie Oakley came from. Now the other, and this is much more romantic. So if they're going to make a movie about Annie Oakley, I think this is the other theory they might go with, is when she was escaping from the people who had kidnapped is they held her, the wolves held her in slave labor for 2 years. And when she was escaping from them, she ran away and she made it to a train station, and there was a man who helped her. Gave her money so she could get back to her family. So the romantic version of this is that his name was Mr. Oakley, and thanks for his being an angel of deliverance at that time, chose that name. It's less likely, but I like it as a story. So she says, because a lot of people ask that it's an area in Cincinnati and she liked it and it fit well with her name. She had to choose a stage name, so she went with Oakley.
Okay, so I'm going to backtrack to Annie, Get Your Gun. I'm crushed. I was in that in high school. No, but no, I do want to, in the chat, Cora mentioned a couple of things, a PBS special on Annie Oakley, and then a movie that Barbara Stanwyck was in on Annie Oakley. And I thought I would get your opinion on those. And just so everyone knows, the book that Elsa mentioned and these video options, we will put all of that in the email that comes to you tomorrow. So you don't have to worry about writing all of this down tonight. But I want to get your approval before I send this out.
Thank you. I think I've seen, I haven't, you know, it's hard to find that old Barbara Stanwyck movie, but I saw, I think, a picture of it, and she had cleavage. I believe there was cleavage involved, which would never again have been Annie Oakley. High neck Victorian. I mean, just think, Victorian lady. That's who she was, even though she was out in the arena all the time doing all that, you know. And she prided herself in never wearing a pair of trousers, by the way. That was seriously that was one of the things that she would say in those trials, is I've never had a pair of trousers on, you know, she only was in skirts. I'm sorry, what was the question?
Well, just I wondered if you knew either the PBS special or the Barbara Stanwyck, and if you recommended them or not.
Yes,
yeah,
PBS special, absolutely. They always do such a good job, and you know a lot of what I have even spoken about, you will hear just her determination to be known as a lady and the Victorian age, you know. So a lot of that would be reaffirmed, but the PBS special is great. I was unable to find access to the Barbara Stanwyck movie. I just remember seeing, you know, and there was also like a series kind of in the beginning of television, a girl with braids and a cowboy hat. So it was kind of merging the Annie Oakley from the Wild West with maybe who Annie Oakley is, but nowhere near. But again, that was more the legend that was Annie Oakley. Just like now, the legend that was Buffalo Bill, he loved and would have totally supported. When she would read there was a book that came out in London in 1887, the Annie Oakley Life, Feats, and Exploits, and everything in it was fiction. Every part of it. It said she was born in Kansas, and all these, so that's how my program usually starts. Is like, I have read so many things put about me in print, and they're not true. So that's a repeated theme in Annie Oakley's life, is things that were written about her that were not true. And part of it was the legend that was becoming who she was. Frank Butler, her husband, said, "Annie, you're becoming a legend in your own time," which she didn't really like.
Well, speaking of Frank, so one of Dorothy Stratton's questions was, could you talk about the nuances of the relationship between Buffalo Bill and then Annie and Frank? So is there more you can tell us about the two of them, or the three, how they interacted?
Yeah, I think certainly Frank Butler was her manager and protector. But the fact that, she was known as Miss Annie Oakley and performed out, and I think she was quite independent in terms of her persona and pursuit of her performances and reputation. But he was the solid person in the background. I mean, he was willing to be in the background. Now, he was protective of her reputation in a huge way. So I think there was a time when Annie walked away from Buffalo Bill's show right after the London performance. Lillian Smith comes into the picture. So for those of you that want to, PBS special talks about Lillian Smith, and she's an interesting character to, look at. There was jealousy, certainly competition between Lillian Smith, and there is some thought that was the dividing thing that happened, and that in a way, Annie Oakley, her reputation was maybe as prominent as Buffalo Bill's, and that wouldn't have sit well with Buffalo Bill. I mean, he really did want to be the mainliner, and she was absolutely becoming just as much the talk of town as was Buffalo Bill, so there might have been some jealousy there, but they left the show for a year and they tried to do some other things. And as you read some of her story, Frank would say, "Oh, it's no good, Annie, we can't be associated with that because that is not the real thing." There was this a Wild West show that they had done a contract with, but they the minute they got there, they could tell this is not the real thing. Buffalo Bill, I think they'd been spoiled with Buffalo Bill. He had real cowboys, real vaqueros, and real Indians, real Indians, that's what they were called. And this guy, it was not a good show. And Frank right away just said, "Annie, I can't have your name associated with that." So I think he was very protective of her. And there was a reconciliation with Buffalo Bill. And she then went back. And when they went back for the Paris show and then toured Europe for 3 years, then she was back as part of the show. Nate Salisbury, who was the manager, definitely a part of the story when he came to the Wild West. He knew the value of Annie Oakley and the draw that her name was. She really was just as beloved in London. I mean, that would be hard to say, but I believe she was way up there, if not just as popular as Buffalo Bill when it came to London. And the society there captivated by Buffalo Bill, but also captivated by Annie Oakley.
A question just came in. Did Frank and Annie have children?
No, they did not. And who knows? I mean, they had a life on the road. As she said, well, I lived the life of a gypsy. So they were on the road most of the time. That doesn't necessarily explain that, She had a great relationship with all her nieces and nephews, of which there were many. Her niece, Swartout, she wrote another book about Annie Oakley, Missie and the Life and Times of Annie Oakley. It's Annie Fern Swartout, so that's her niece, wrote a book about that. She was very close with her family. There is some thought that during those years, those 2 years when she was abused by the wolves, and that's when she's 10 to 12 years old, that there could have been sexual abuse that would have prevented her from having children. That's a possibility that she would have never said.
So can I shift gears to, you talked about real Indians in the Wild West show. So I'm going to read Dorothy's question because I don't want to misrepresent it by paraphrasing. So wasn't the idea of white settlers taking over Indian land just a natural turn of events as far as Americans of European background were concerned in the 19th century? And also, it seems that white people in the Buffalo Bill Wild West show respected the Indians, but still regarded them as social inferiors. Can you say more about the way the general white mainstream public felt about the Indians, and then a little more about how the Indians and the whites related to each other in the Wild West troupe?
Yeah, well, that's literally books are written about that, which I've been trying to read to, because it is anything I say at this point is it's a complicated issue, and so you have to at a certain point choose to we could look at it from our perspective, in which case we take offense and we say, wow, that was just so wrong. Which certainly from our perspective, we go, oh, that just doesn't seem right. So, but let's go back and look at what was going on from the perspective of the frontier day and the American story that was unfolding, specifically the frontier. So yes, there was a natural, sea to shining sea, we're gonna, this is this great land and the Indians are in our way and they're so violent, and what I would say is, yes, that was the way the story was going to go. The white man was going to settle the frontier, and the Indians needed to get out of the way. So that was a tragic thing that was happening. But what Buffalo Bill did, and even then he got pushback. There were agencies in place to protect, protect the Indian, protect the Native American, control the Native American, control the Indians, which protection is a different thing. But when the government policy was either containment or extinction, the fact is that Buffalo Bill, in his drama of civilization and his moving picture of the frontier, showed a worthy opponent. And I think if there was an American perspective, it was fear and admiration and curiosity about because the people who are out there, the settlers, and they're running into the Indians. The story back in New York that is being told, they want to see, what is this? We want to watch movies about momentous occasions. There were no movies, so Buffalo Bill brought this picture, a moving picture of what was going on in the frontier, and the Indians were a part of that. So what is so cool is that the Native Americans, I'm using the word that they used, and that is Indians. Now, the other thing, and Larry McCurtry brought this up, Buffalo Bill and anyone who worked with the Indians was really like the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Ogallala. They would be specific when it came to, well, we have so many Sioux and so many Lakota and so many, they were tribe specific because the tribes were very specific. But when you're speaking about it in general, they would just say Indian. I think they were held up as a worthy opponent. They were a beaten people, but they were shown as a fascinating and worthy opponent of the settlers, of the cavalry, whatever, of Custer. So that picture was shown, and then these Indians, these various tribes, were part of the show, but they were allowed to bring their culture. It wasn't like you have to stay in the hotel rooms and you can't be an Indian. You can only dress up like that on the show. They actually brought they would bring their wives. There was even just babies born on the tour, and they brought their culture to the show. So like when I was a girl, when I was a little girl, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, they had the circus would come, and part of going to the circus was going down to the train tracks and seeing where they were all camped out. And you could see the cars with animals in it. Well, going to the Wild West show, the big attraction of that would be go way ahead of time and walk through the camp. And you got to see these Indians in their teepees and with their campfires and cooking. You got to have a taste of an entire culture that was, by government standards, wanted to make extinct. But here they are being then shown in, and that's where, when that got brought to Europe, I think that's where the fascination with Germany and England, they got to see this entire other culture. Now you can say exploitation, all those things, yeah, there was an element of that. And they had to play over and over the conquered person, or the bad guy. They always had to play the bad guy. They just did. But at the same time, their culture was honored in that telling of that story. That was a part that people really did get to see. It was a mix of things. It was a mix of good and bad, a good of hard and beautiful. There's great story of when, Sitting Bull became adopted Annie Oakley. And so he joined the show for a little bit. So here he was right there in the tents, and he was supposedly the killer of Custer, so there were Americans that had opinions about that, and they'd boo him and call him a savage, and he kind of just didn't care, because they also kind of were scared and admired him. It was a mix of things. Yeah. That doesn't really begin, honestly, books are written about it. Let me say one other thing. I don't know if I'm saying too much, but there were agencies in place that were supposedly, going to prevent the Indians from being exploited and show Indians. They were against that. But every single Indian that was part of Buffalo Bill's show, now Buffalo Bill was unique in that he really did treat all those Indians, all the Native Americans. He paid them, he treated them with a great deal of respect. And they wanted to be there. There were agencies saying, you can't do that, and they tried to prevent it. But anytime they asked them, the Indians, they just never listened to them. They would say that they wanted to, they liked being part of his show. And because the alternative was being stuck on the reservation and dying a slow death. So here they were kind of being forced to play the bad man, and they were, there was an element that might have, I don't know how that felt for them, but it was preferable to sitting on the reservation and being out of the way. So it's a complicated picture, but there is a voice that was trying to be heard. That is the voice of the Native American themselves, the Indians themselves, and sometimes put quite poetically, of knowing that Buffalo Bill had a big heart and that he was for them and he treated them with respect and he paid them fair wages. So.
We had a comment. It's not really a question, but a comment. Louise is saying she's reading 80 Days by Matthew Goodman, and Nellie Bly became a celebrity in 1890. And it's interesting that Annie Oakley was another female celebrity at the time. So seeing a parallel there.
Yeah, yeah. The things that were in motion in the country that.
Now you've given me a question that I've never encountered any kind of answer to this, but I hadn't thought of it before. Was Annie Oakley supportive of suffrage, women's suffrage?
No. Well, I mean, she had parameters. Okay, ladies, she's a Victorian woman. And she's absolutely for women getting to do things like you need to learn how to shoot a gun. So that's unusual. When it came to suffrage and the woman voting, she said, well, I'm not really for it unless only the good women vote. She literally said that, yeah. That she didn't think it was a very good idea unless only the good women could vote. So she had I think she just had her hesitation to think that that was an arena, so to speak, in which women should be players. She didn't have any, and Buffalo Bill and she apparently argued on this matter, because he felt that they should, and she was not convinced.
Interesting. So the good people vote. She didn't say anything more specifically about what that meant.
What would make a good person? My guess is with Quaker and that it would have to be people of with dignity and character and integrity or whatever, which she considered herself. And tried to maintain that, But yeah. So interestingly, as much as she was for women having independent, she even wrote to 2 different presidents saying that she would organize a regiment of women shooters prepared to protect the home front. So I mean, and she was even willing to concede that women could wear pants if they had to. I mean, that was a huge concession for her. So she was willing to go there, but not to the vote. So interesting.
Now, I love it. Ruth is making a connection to Gertrude Bell, and anyone who was on that book discussion, that was a very similar stance that Gertrude Bell had about suffrage. Yeah. Good job, Ruth. You are really paying attention. You get a gold star today. That's great. Any other questions? I'm not seeing other things in the chat. I did want to make an observation. I don't know if you've thought of this, but when you were talking about the Wild West show died out because of film, it reminds me of the Chautauqua circuit that died out because of film. Yeah.
Well, yes. Okay. So that was, I mean, then there's this, and actually that was the first time I heard about the Indian films that Buffalo Bill tried to make. And I really loved what he was saying about, as he tried to film Wounded Knee, not realizing that was a wound that was way too close. And the portrayal of it portrayed us as the bad guys that we were, and that the wound was just too fresh for him to somehow make into a movie that could be anything but painful. So I thought that was a really interesting thing, that he tried to ride that train of making films, but the thing that he accomplished in the show, he could not get the same kind of reaction for in a movie. But in that, what you just said about the Chautauqua, and now kind of there's a resurgence, of Chautauqua. Ellen might know this since you're in Colorado. I don't know if other states have this, something called the Western Airs. Ellen, have you ever gone to a Western Airs program? Do you know what I'm talking about? You're still muted, Ellen. Sorry. Well, anyway. Okay, she doesn't know she's muted. Okay, she's trying to
unmute.
There you
So
go.
I've seen people doing acrobatics on horseback at the Jefferson County Fairgrounds, which is sort of near the foothills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the Western Airs, which is a whole horse show, is based on Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and they do the horses that kind of weave in and out of each other, and there's a stagecoach that comes out. So it is actually based on the Wild West show, and that is just as popular now, I think, as ever, because it is real. And so even though movies are super fun, and the Western, the Western took over a huge part of filmmaking, there is a real show called Western Errors, and it is like the Wild West show. It kind of, obviously not they don't have Indians shooting arrows and stuff, but they do have the horse thing and all that.
Here's another question that came in. Can you say more about Sitting Bull adopting Annie Oakley?
Yeah. There was just a real affection and admiration he had for her. He saw her performing, and he was amazed at her ability, and then asked to meet her, and she kept ignoring him, and he finally sent her a picture, and then he asked to meet her, and she said, "Oh, yeah, of course, I'll meet you," and he just spoke with great admiration of her skill, and said how she reminded him of his daughter. And he gave her the moccasins that she had. So it became kind of a father-daughter interesting. And that is a painful part of the Annie, Get Your Gun to me. I mean, it kind of makes it almost comical, that the Indian thing, but it was a tender thing. And she does she laughs. She says, well, as an adopted daughter, I'm entitled to 7 ponies and 2 wigwams and, any number of whatever livestock. But it gave her, and she only spoke with admiration of when she talked about the Indians, she would talk about, well, they sometimes gamble too much, and they started having me watch their money for them because I wouldn't let them spend too much, and that she had a very protective and kind of motherly friendship with all of the Indians that were part of the show. But that friendship with, that was something special for her and for him, interestingly.
Are there any last questions? I see a thank you from Beth that this has been very interesting.
Good.
But I don't see anything else coming in. We do have a survey that Star just put in the chat, but we're also going to send you an email that will have the survey tomorrow, and we'll include the books that she talked about, including the one that the sister wrote. I jotted that down. So we'll send all of that in case people want to keep reading, which is a wonderful thing. That survey should pop up when you leave this Zoom tonight. It mostly works, but sometimes it doesn't. So we will send you an email tomorrow with follow-up if you don't want to fill it out right now. But we appreciate that. We need feedback for our granting agencies, and we are going to continue these book discussions next year. So we'll be releasing all of that information in our event program this summer, but there's been enough support and interest, and some of you keep coming back. Thank you. But we decided we want to keep this happening. So our 2023 troop, we're in the works of organizing all of those book talks. So as we come to a close tonight, now you need to get out your planners and look and see how you can make it to Ashland, Ohio, July 12th through the 16th. We're going to start with Lizzie Borden, then Malcolm X, then Mary Surratt. Then we'll have Susan Marie, who's on the call, doing Marie Curie, and Elsa will end things up with Annie Oakley. And it's a great week. We have the evening performances out in this beautiful open air band shell. We have opening music. We have workshops throughout the week for youth and for adults. So it's worth the trip. And those of you who are local, we know many of you have been supporters for years and years. And so we're hoping to see you out again. So Elsa, thank you so much for going above and beyond, because you said Annie Oakley's your character, but you have given us this broad background, I think, to approach her life and things that we will see in your performance, I'm sure. But even if people don't make it to Ashland and are just reading about her, you've given us a nice, feels like the whole Wild West show is surrounding us tonight, and we appreciate that.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Well, it was certainly fun for me to get a broader picture. So thank you all for bringing me there.
So thank you everyone for coming. We will invite you back next November on Zoom if you can't make it in July. But this has been a great five book series, and it makes us proud that it's gone as well as it has. So thanks everyone, and have a wonderful evening. I will let you go. And like I say, when I close things out, you should see, I switched back to gallery view here. You should see the survey that you could, if you'll fill it out quickly for us, we would be very appreciative. And I will wish you all a good evening or afternoon if you're in Colorado. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.